In a stormy morning, as the sky filled with heavy, dark clouds, the archaeological team gathered in River Valley. It was a place known to few, hidden among imposing mountains and dense vegetation. Rumors of an ancient civilization that had existed there had drawn the attention of scholars and the curious, yet few had dared to venture into its depths. However, this day would be different. A discovery was about to unfold, something that would forever change the understanding of human history. As the archaeologists unearthed layers of soil, a metallic sound echoed, capturing everyone's attention. Intrigued, they moved closer and began to dig more carefully, revealing an object that looked like an ancient artifact. It was a stone tablet, covered in enigmatic inscriptions that seemed to pulse with an ancestral mystery. The team leader, a man with a piercing gaze named Caleb, stepped forward, running his fingers across the stone's surface. The letters were familiar, but the combination and context were utterly unknown. The tension in the air was palpable. Caleb turned to his team, his voice shaking with excitement. This is something you don't see every day. This inscription alludes to the Nephilim. The word resonated among them like a distant echo, recalling the whispers of stories about giant beings, the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men. Those who, according to legend, had walked the earth before the Great Flood. The team, composed of historians, linguists, and archaeologists, gathered around the tablet, examining every detail. The inscription spoke of an ancient alliance, a pact between creatures of great power and human beings, promising protection and knowledge. Nevertheless, there was also a tone of warning. The Nephilim are not mere legends, one of the linguists, Marcus, mused in a low voice, as if he feared the simple act of speaking about them might invoke something from the past. If they were here, then where did they go? What happened to them after the flood? Those questions hung in the air, weighted with an unbearable significance. The narrator's heart, having listened in silence, was racing. He was a curious explorer of history and hidden truths, always seeking answers that lay concealed in the shadows of the past. With every discovery, a new chapter opened, and this was an opportunity that could not be ignored. What did this inscription mean? What was the true history of the Nephilim? Caleb, sensing his team's unrest, spoke again. We need to investigate this. The Nephilim may have left marks in other places, not just this valley. We need to know where they went after the flood, if they went anywhere at all. The group nodded, their determination growing by the minute. This was only the tip of the iceberg. The story that would unfold in the coming hours was full of mysteries and revelations. The narrator, driven by a mixture of fear and fascination, decided it was time to delve deeper into this quest. The inscription etched into the stone was not only a starting point, but also an invitation to explore the unknown. He found himself carrying a blank notebook, which would soon become his faithful companion on this journey. Every new piece of information, every discovery would be noted, recorded, eternalized. As the day transformed into night, the team dispersed, each member aware of the importance of their mission. The narrator decided to stay a little longer, absorbing the magical atmosphere of the place. The gentle wind rustled the leaves around, and the faint twilight illuminated the ancient tablet, as if it were a beacon on the path to truth. He knew that what was to come could change the way they understood their own history, and perhaps even their own origins. In the following days, the narrator immersed himself in ancient books, searching for any mention of the Nephilim. He uncovered forgotten texts that spoke of the corruption they brought to earth, of the wisdom they possessed, and of the great calamity that befell the world due to their actions. A clear connection emerged. The Nephilim were involved in a battle between worlds, between the human and the divine. They were not just mythical figures, but part of a legacy that shaped humanity. The research led him to diverse sources, biblical texts, Sumerian writings, legends of ancient civilizations. Each new piece of data brought a new layer of complexity to the story. The narrator began to understand that the inscription was not a mere fragment of a forgotten past. It was the key to an enigma that had long awaited a solution. He questioned incessantly, if the Nephilim had truly existed, what was their fate after the flood? What remained of them in the world, and how did they influence the development of civilization? Questions piled up, and the need for answers became increasingly urgent. The narrator knew his journey had only just begun. Every answer would bring new challenges, new possibilities, and he was willing to follow that path, no matter how dangerous it might be. The search for truth lay before him, filled with hidden mysteries and dangers. That night, as the narrator gazed at the stars shining in the deep sky, he made a promise to himself. He would not rest until all questions were answered, until the truth about the Nephilim was unearthed, not only for himself, but for all those who sought to understand their history, the history of humanity. The journey had already begun, and it promised to be unforgettable. The atmosphere in River Valley was permeated with a pulsing energy. as if the stones themselves wanted to whisper their secrets to the group of archaeologists. The narrator, immersed in the investigation, felt invaded by renewed determination. The ancient tablet was not just an artifact, it was a portal to a forgotten past, and who knows, a path to discover the truth about the Nephilim. In the following days, he dedicated himself tirelessly to reading ancient texts, spending hours in dusty libraries and digital archives, searching for any mention of giants in various cultures. Every page turned was like a new clue in a puzzle that was becoming increasingly intriguing. The connection between civilizations seemed more than mere coincidence. There was a pattern that could not be ignored. He discovered that it was not only the Hebrews who spoke of beings of colossal stature. The Sumerians, in Mesopotamia, mentioned the Azant. Anunnaki, described as gods who descended to Earth and interacted with humanity. Greek myths brought forth the Titans, giants who faced the Olympian gods in epic battles, and the Norse had the Jotun, described as beings of immeasurable strength. It was as if, in every corner of the world, the memory of immense creatures resonated through the ages. The narrator's fascination grew as he delved into the stories of civilizations that existed in remote times, of cultures that never met, yet shared. A common narrative about beings who inhabited the earth before the flood. He carefully noted the similarities between the descriptions and the characteristics attributed to these giants. In all narratives, there was an element of power, of fear, and of a knowledge that transcended common human experience. Meanwhile, the weather in River Valley was changing, reflecting the narrator's growing uneasiness. The dark clouds that had once brought storms now dissipated, giving way to a clear, starry sky. The nights became moments of contemplation and reflection. Sitting on a rock under the soft moonlight, he wondered if the Nephilim had truly left traces of their presence in all those accounts. If they existed, where would they have gone after the flood? What might have become of that ancient alliance mentioned on the tablet? These questions led him to explore texts that many considered obscure. The Book of Enoch, for example, described the Watchers, angels who descended from heaven and united with the daughters of men, generating a giant progeny. The narrator read intently about the curse that fell upon them, the divine judgment that resulted in the Great Flood, and the promise that the Nephilim would still be present on Earth, even after the destruction. Every discovery fueled his curiosity. The narrator began to mentally map the stories, connecting the dots between the tales of giants and the possible location of archaeological remains that could corroborate these narratives. He noted that many of the places mentioned in ancient accounts aligned with where great civilizations flourished: Egypt, Mesopotamia, and even the northern lands, where the Vikings erected their longships. One morning, while reviewing his notes, an idea surged strongly. He decided he needed a more practical approach. It wasn't enough just to read. He needed to visit those places, talk with experts, and perhaps even discover new artifacts that could shed light on the Nephilim's origin. Inspiration consumed him, and he began to plan an expedition that would take him to several key points around the world. During a conversation with Caleb, the team leader, the narrator shared his idea. Caleb, always open to new possibilities, looked into the narrator's eyes with a gleam of understanding. "You're right. We need to step out of the paper and into the field. The answers may be right in front of us, hidden beneath layers of earth and time." The team, invigorated by the new mission, began to prepare. The narrator felt he was at a crossroads, about to embark on a journey that would not only change his life, but could rewrite the history of humanity. The words on the ancient tablet echoed in his mind, a promise that the past still had much to reveal. And so, with a notebook in hand and a heart pounding with anticipation, he was ready to follow the call of the unknown. As the team prepared for the trip, the narrator felt the pressure of time, the search for answers. About the Nephilim had become not only an obsession, but a vital necessity. He knew that every step on this journey would bring him closer to a truth disguised in the shadows of history, and with that, he bid farewell to River Valley, a place that now held not only mysteries, but also the beginning of a new era of discoveries. Thus, as the sun set on the horizon, coloring the sky in orange and purple, the narrator looked toward the future with hope and determination. The road ahead was full of uncertainties, but every solved enigma only added more depth to his quest. The Nephilim, with their ancient and powerful stories, were still to be unveiled, and he was about to discover where they had truly gone after the flood. The narrator immersed himself in the pages of Genesis, its words reverberating in his mind. The passage that spoke of the sons of God and the daughters of men had always been subject to debate and interpretation. Many scholars tried to explain who these sons were, and what the union between divine and human beings meant. For some, they were angels who descended to earth, while others argued they were royal lineages. This ambiguity deeply intrigued him. He recalled a conference he had attended where a renowned theologian argued that the most accepted interpretation was that the sons of God referred to descendants of Seth, while the daughters of men were the descendants of Cain. That view, however, seemed too simplistic. The narrator couldn't help but think there was more to the story than traditional scholars were willing to suggest. He questioned, if the Nephilim were, in fact, the offspring of these unions, what did that mean for their understanding of human history? Throughout the week, the nights became deeper and quieter, save for the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. The narrator sat at the table, surrounded by old editions of sacred texts and notes, trying to organize his ideas. He began to trace the different interpretations that had emerged over the centuries, the sons of God as celestial beings, as royal lineages, and even as a representation of concepts of divinity and mortality. These reflections led him to ponder the cultural impact of this narrative on different societies. The concept of giants was not restricted to just one or two cultures. It was a global phenomenon. The accounts of the Nephilim could be an explanation for the myths of gigantic creatures that arose in various civilizations. The narrator began to sketch a timeline, noting the similarities between the Nephilim, the Anunnaki, and the Titans, linking the narratives through their origins and legacies. The atmosphere of curiosity and restlessness accompanied him when he decided it was time to deepen these ideas. The Book of Enoch, which he had already read in fragments, promised a more detailed view of the Watchers and their relationship with the Nephilim. With renewed determination, he sought an edition of the work, aware that many versions had been lost or censored throughout history. Upon finally finding a copy, he felt he had secured a hidden treasure. As he read, he was fascinated by the descriptions of the Watchers and their interactions with humanity. The text was rich in detail, describing how these beings taught humanity about metallurgy, magic, and astronomy. The narrator felt a chill imagining what could have happened if that knowledge were used for sinister purposes. What began as a curiosity transformed into a growing concern. What if the Nephilim had, in fact, left their marks on history, not just in texts, but in monumental structures and rituals they still didn't fully understand? The following nights were filled with vivid dreams. He saw images of giants walking through unknown lands, their shadows cast over growing civilizations. The dreams left him uneasy, but also fueled him with a sense of urgency. He needed to share his discoveries with Caleb and the team. Conversations about the interpretations of the sacred texts and their implications could open new avenues of investigation. On a sunny morning, the narrator gathered the team around the work table. With a map in hand, he began to explain his theories and draw connections between the places where ancient civilizations flourished and the accounts of encounters with the Nephilim. If the Watchers truly existed and united with the daughters of men, that could explain the stories of giants in various cultures, he argued, his voice firm. We need to investigate these places. We need to understand if what they left behind can be found in the form of artifacts or constructions. The team was receptive, with Caleb nodding in agreement. Yes, that makes sense. We have to go to those places and see if we can find anything that validates your theories. The answers might be hidden in ruins that have not yet been explored. The enthusiasm grew as the narrator spoke, fueling the flame of curiosity that had ignited not only in him, but in everyone around him. Discussions about the probable locations of the expeditions began to take shape. Egypt, with its imposing pyramids, Sumerian Mesopotamia, and even the Nordic lands, where the myths of giants were still told in oral traditions. The narrator recalled a passage from the Book of Enoch, which specifically mentioned Mount Hermon as the place of descent of the Watchers, a point he knew must be visited. At the end of the meeting, plan was underway. The team would begin preparing the expeditions, organizing logistics and resources, while the narrator would delve further into the investigation, seeking evidence that could support his theories. He was determined to leave no stone unturned, and the possibility of discovering traces of the Nephilim propelled him every day. As the sun set, the narrator watched the sky change color, reflecting the nuances of his own reflections. He was about to embark on a journey that sought not only answers about the Nephilim, but also about the very meaning of human existence and the fragility of collective memory. The story unfolding before him was much more than a simple archaeological quest. It was an exploration of what it means to be human in a world where past and present impressively collide. The narrator took a breath and began to describe the names of the Watcher leaders that emerged from the pages of the Book of Enoch. He spoke of Samiaza, the chief of the Watchers, who had made the covenant with his brethren to descend to earth, and of Azazel, who brought humans the knowledge of metallurgy and warfare. Each name was like a key, unlocking doors to a deeper understanding of the consequences of those descents. With an intense gaze, he turned to the team, who listened avidly, absorbing every word as if they were in a ritual. These Watchers by uniting with the daughters of men, not only generated the Nephilim, but also brought a new set of knowledge and skills that in their hands could be both a blessing and a curse, the narrator continued. He paused, allowing his words to settle in the air, like dust from an ancient ruined temple. Caleb's eyes shone with the excitement of discovery. So, are you saying that these beings were not just mythological figures, but direct influences on the societies that formed later? What kind of teachings did they bring? Exactly, the narrator replied with a lightness in his voice. The Book of Enoch mentions knowledge of enchantments, astrology, and even sorcery. Each of them brought something valuable, but at the same time, the consequences were devastating. He remembered the images he had seen in his dreams of the giants walking, their shadows stretching over humanity, without knowing if they were protectors or oppressors. Murmurs of disagreement and curiosity began to arise among the team members. Someone asked, what happened to those watchers after corruption took hold of everything? Were they punished? The narrator nodded, his expression becoming serious. According to the text, the Watchers were condemned to wander on Earth, trapped between the worlds. Their fall brought a moral collapse and an era of violence. Narratives about their actions spread through various cultures, transforming into legends of gods and monsters. He gestured with his hands as if to highlight the connection between past and present, between what was and what is. Does this mean that the stories of giants we find in different mythologies can be fragments of the same truth? Emily questioned, her voice filled with hope and disbelief. The narrator smiled, acknowledging the complexity of the question. Yes, Emily, the Nephilim may be the roots of those stories, the explanation for the presence of gigantic beings in cultures that never had direct contact. As he spoke, he took an ancient map he had found in his research and spread it on the table. Look here, he said, pointing to specific areas. These places are filled with ruins that may be connected to those Watchers. Mount Hermon, where they supposedly descended, is one of the keys to understanding this narrative. The team's eyes fixed on the map, and the atmosphere in the room became palpable, filled with possibilities. Now, the journey was not just about discovering the truth, but also about understanding the implications that truth would have for modern society. If the Watchers brought knowledge that corrupted humanity's morality, what does that say about the knowledge we seek today? Caleb inquired, his mind churning with the depth of the question. Perhaps we should consider that not all knowledge is a blessing, the narrator replied with a thoughtful tone. The wisdom we acquire must be treated with responsibility. What the Watchers brought was not just technology, but an understanding that could be easily twisted. The conversation flowed, now filled with heated debates about ethics, morality, and the role of knowledge in human evolution. The narrator felt like a guide, leading his team through a labyrinth of ideas and questions where every corner could reveal a new truth or a new mystery. With the sun setting, the golden light illuminated the room, casting long shadows over the tables. The discussions began to heat up, and the narrator had a moment of clarity. We need to investigate the direct consequences of the Watchers' actions more thoroughly. We cannot just be satisfied with knowing what they brought. We must analyze what that meant for the civilizations that followed them. He paused, allowing his words to settle in the air. We need to visit places that may have been influenced by those beings. The ruins of Baalbek, the pyramids of Egypt, and even the sacred sites in Mesopotamia. Each of them may contain traces of the Nephilim's presence. Enthusiasm grew among the team. Each member began to discuss which places might be most significant, which had the most potential to reveal hidden secrets. The idea that they might be searching for forgotten truths, for connections that linked the past with the present, moved them. The narrator felt a warmth grow in his chest. This was a mission that surpassed mere academic curiosity. It was a search for something essential that could change the way humanity viewed its own history. As the day transformed into night, the team prepared for a new journey. The narrator looked at the stars beginning to shine in the sky, feeling that, just like the Watchers who descended to Earth, they too were about to cross a threshold. But a threshold that could lead them to discover not only what happened to the Nephilim after the flood, but also what lessons were still hidden in the shadows of history. The narrator observed the intensity on the faces of the team, as if every word spoken created a deeper connection between them. Speaking about the consequences of the Watchers' descent and the origin of the Nephilim, he realized that it was not just a simple historical narrative, but a reflection on the fragility of human morality. He took a deep breath, feeling the need to investigate more thoroughly what had happened after the catastrophe of the flood. A thoughtful silence fell over the room as the team pondered the implications of the Watchers' actions. The flood, as a deliberate act of spiritual and genetic cleansing, began to take shape in their minds. If the flood was a judgment on humanity, does that mean the Nephilim and their progenitors were considered a threat to the divine order? Emily questioned, her voice filled with curiosity. Exactly, the narrator replied. The flood can be seen as a form of purification. Religious narratives in various cultures speak of the need for a new beginning, a moral reset. The Nephilim, in essence, symbolize the corruption of creation, a violation of the natural order. He paused, allowing that idea to sink into the mind of every team member. But what happened to those who survived? Were there traces of the Nephilim that persisted after this catastrophe? Caleb, always eager for more knowledge, quickly intervened. Are there accounts of later civilizations that claim to have found giants? Stories of men who were not completely human and possessed extraordinary abilities? The narrator nodded, recalling how humanity's collective memory often distorted the truth, transforming mythical figures into legends of divinities. Or monsters. Yes. From the ancient Egyptians to the Norse, we find references to beings that defy logic. The accounts may be fragments of the same truth, the continuity of the Nephilim lineage, even after the flood. This raises an intriguing question. How did humanity deal with these vestiges of corruption? The narrator looked at each member of the team, encouraging them to reflect on the impact such knowledge could have on their lives and their understandings of the modern world. With a broad gesture, he returned to the map, now with an air of urgency. If we can trace the line between the Nephilim and the civilizations that succeeded them, we must explore each of those cultures. The traces may be hidden in their mythologies, in their constructions, even in their oral traditions. He ran his finger over the Caucasus region and then over parts of the Middle East. We need to investigate places where history and archaeology intersect, where the lands were not only inhabited, but shaped by beings that should not exist. The team looked at each other, the excitement growing as the magnitude of the mission began to reveal itself. Victor, usually more reserved, raised his hand and asked, "What if the Nephilim really left marks on our genetics? Could we find traces of them in us?" The narrator smiled at the question, knowing that the idea could be both terrifying and fascinating. That is a possibility we cannot ignore. The stories of giants may very well be intertwined with the very essence of humanity. The conversation continued to flow, each member contributing new ideas and questions. The narrator felt energized by the exchange of thoughts and by the clarity that was beginning to emerge. He knew he was guiding his team down a path that could lead them to discover truths long forgotten or ignored. So, let's analyze the accounts of civilizations that emerged after the flood, Emily suggested, her voice now charged with determination. We need to investigate the texts that speak of these encounters. And more importantly, we must look for the archaeological evidence that corroborates those stories. The team agreed, each with a gleam in their eyes, ready to delve into a new phase of the investigation. The narrator, however, could not help but feel a little apprehensive. The journey they were about to embark on would not only explore the past, but also confront them with philosophical questions about what it means to be human. The morality and ethics that knowledge brought were a burden none of them could take lightly. Before we leave, there's one last idea I would like to discuss, the narrator said, seeking to establish a final focus before launching into the investigation. We need to consider the possibility that the knowledge brought by the Watchers was not only dangerous, but also necessary. Could it be that humanity, even in its corruption, could have learned something valuable? The ability to create, to innovate, may have come from the same source that brought destruction. The team fell silent, pondering the duality of knowledge. Could it be possible that what the Watchers did was both a blessing and a curse? That reflection hung in the air as the group prepared for the next stage of their journey. The narrator, now more confident, felt they were ready to face the truths that awaited them, even if they were uncomfortable. With their hearts racing and their minds buzzing with questions, they prepared to explore the ruins that promised to reveal more about the Nephilim and their legacy. The road ahead would not be easy, but the search for answers would unite them even more, as they ventured into a territory where the ancient and the modern intertwined in an unusual way. And so, with renewed determination, the team launched into the search for traces of the Nephilim lineage, ready to unveil the mysteries that time had hidden. The narrator felt the weight of expectation in the room as each team member prepared to delve into a new phase of the investigation. They were about to explore the legacy of the Nephilim, not only through ancient texts, but through the marks they might have left on the earth and in history. To understand what happened to the Nephilim after the flood, we need to look at the structures they may have built or influenced, he began, his voice resonating with a mixture of determination and curiosity. One of the places we must investigate is Baalbek, Lebanon, he suggested, pointing to the region on the map. The ruins there are some of the most impressive in the ancient world. The temples, especially the Temple of Jupiter, are built with stones weighing hundreds of tons. How could human beings from an ancient civilization move such blocks without the knowledge we have today? Victor, always with an analytical mind, intervened. There are theories suggesting that the ancient Egyptians used ramps and levers to move the stones, but even so, the precision and size of the stones in Baalbek defy any conventional explanation. If we are talking about Nephilim, perhaps that technique is only part of the solution. The narrator nodded, acknowledging the depth of Victor's observation. Exactly. What if we consider the possibility that the Nephilim contributed to the knowledge and construction techniques? After all, their skills and knowledge were described as extraordinary. The Book of Enoch mentions that they taught humans advanced knowledge in metallurgy, astronomy, and even architecture. Emily, enthusiastic, began to leaf through her notes. What else do we know about megalithic structures that may have a connection to the Nephilim? Are there other places we could investigate besides Baalbek? Yes, the narrator replied, energized. Another interesting place is the Göbekli Tepe complex in Turkey, dating back over 11,000 years. Long before the invention of agriculture, the stones there are intricately carved in form circles that may have been used in rituals. The fascinating thing is that it is not known exactly why or how such a primitive civilization was able to create something so complex. Caleb, always eager for more information, frowned. But what if those structures were not just places of worship, but also a reflection of the Nephilim's influence? Could we be looking at the remains of a civilization that had direct contact with them, beings who were seen as gods or demigods? The narrator smiled, loving the direction the conversation was taking. Exactly. The stories of gods who interacted with humanity in various cultures may be interpretations of the interactions they had with the Nephilim. The ancient Egyptians, for example, spoke of Osiris and Isis, who could be honored in temples built under the influence of these figures. Victor frowned, reflecting. But that leads us to a difficult question. If the Nephilim really had such a great influence, how do we deal with that information? If the history we know is only a distorted version of the truth, what is the impact of that on our understanding of humanity? The narrator took a deep breath, recognizing the importance of the question. That is the essence of our investigation. We need to keep an open mind, but also a critical one. History is filled with narratives that were shaped by those who wrote them. So, what we need to do is gather all the available evidence and try to discern the truth. Archaeology can give us clues about how the Nephilim may have influenced the development of civilization, but we also need to look at the narratives that emerge around it. The team was now in a state of fervor, each of them feeling more involved in the search for truth. The narrator perceived that the connection between them was deepening, fueling a collective passion for discovery. Let's prepare to explore these megalithic structures. We need a solid strategy, an approach that combines field research with the analysis of ancient texts. Yes, Caleb agreed with a gleam in his eyes. And perhaps we can even discover the influences those places had on the cultures that came after. If we can map that timeline, we can better understand the continuity of the Nephilim's presence. The narrator smiled, energized by the collaboration and the spirit of investigation that permeated the room. So, let's start compiling data and planning our next expedition. We need to understand how each of these cultures relates to the legacy of the Nephilim. What we know about their traditions, their myths, and their constructions can provide us with valuable clues. As the team dispersed to work on their respective tasks, the narrator felt a wave of anticipation. He knew they were about to enter a new phase of their discoveries, a phase that could not only shed light on the mysteries surrounding the Nephilim, but also transform the way they viewed the very history of humanity. As he watched his colleagues moving with purpose, a new idea began to form in his mind. What if there are sacred mountains that mark the Nephilim's presence, structures that were left as testimony to their existence? That could be a crucial clue. Emily's eyes shone with the suggestion. Sacred mountains? That makes perfect sense. They are mentioned in various cultures and could be places of rituals or worship. Perhaps we can investigate those places as well. Exactly, the narrator replied, feeling the energy in the room growing. They are places that can give us a deeper insight into how those beings were remembered and feared. Let's map those areas and plan how we can explore and document each of them. The group came together again, each contributing ideas and suggestions as the narrative unfolded in unexpected directions. The mystery surrounding the Nephilim was far from solved, and the search for answers was just beginning, promising revelations that could change everything they knew about history and humanity. The narrator took a deep breath, feeling the energy of the team pulsing around him. There was something profoundly significant about the investigation of Mount Hermon, a place that not only housed one of the region's most imposing mountains, but was also imbued with myths that resonated through the ages. Mount Hermon is not just a geographical point, he began, his voice firm and encompassing. It is a symbol. This is the place where, according to the Book of Enoch, the Watchers descended to guide Earth. Here, they made a pact that would change the course of humanity. Caleb, always looking for connections, raised his hand. What if we think about the implications of that pact? If the Nephilim truly existed and interacted with humans, how did that shape our history? Does any archaeological evidence link Mount Hermon to those events? The narrator smiled, pleased with the question. Exactly. Excavations on Mount Hermon revealed not only megalithic structures, but also inscriptions and artifacts that suggest the presence of ancient rituals. Some of these inscriptions are strangely similar to others found in places considered sacred, like Baalbek. Furthermore, there are accounts that the ancient Phoenicians believed Hermon was the home of the gods, a place of communication between the worlds. Victor, intrigued, took a note. These accounts may be the key to understanding how later generations interpreted the figures of the Nephilim. If they were seen as gods, that leads us to question. Who were the humans who worshipped them? And what was the consequence of that for ancient civilizations? The narrator nodded. Those are vital questions. We are going to explore the ruins of Mount Hermon and see what we can find. We need to understand the geography of the place. Hermon is a mountain of 2,814 meters, located on the border between Lebanon and Syria. The altitude not only offers an impressive view, but also makes the area strategic, possibly serving as a meeting point between different cultures. The group prepared for the expedition, and the energy of exploration was in the air. As they walked along steep, rocky paths, the narrator couldn't stop thinking about the importance of that place. The sound of the wind blowing through the trees and the clouds forming in the distance created an almost mystical atmosphere. Imagine, he said as they ascended, what this place would have been like thousands of years ago. The Watchers, descending from the heights, performing rituals, interacting with those who inhabited the valley below. Upon reaching the summit, the group found the ruins of an ancient altar. The stones, large and worn by time, were arranged in a circle. "This is incredible," Emily murmured, running her hand over the rough surface of one of the stones. "We could be standing before a place where rituals in honor of the Watchers were performed." Caleb began to examine the stones more closely. If this really was an altar, what kind of rituals would be performed here? Could they be sacrifices? Or was it a place of celebration? What does this tell us about the relationship between humans and the Nephilim? The narrator, absorbed by the atmosphere of the place, began to describe the possible practices that might have occurred there. It is possible that humans sought to please the Nephilim, offering something in exchange for knowledge or protection. The Book of Enoch mentions that the Watchers taught humans various skills. Perhaps, in return, humans performed rituals to honor them. Victor, looking out at the horizon, intervened. What if those rituals were not just an exchange of favors? What if they represented a form of control? If the Nephilim had power, that could have generated a hierarchy where humans were subordinate to those entities. "An interesting perspective," the narrator replied. "The relationship could be complex, mixing worship and fear, but we need more evidence to support those theories. That's why we are going to explore the ruins further and see what we can uncover." As they explored, they found fragments of pottery and inscriptions on some of the stones, indicating the presence of a civilization that may have lived in harmony or conflict with the Nephilim. The narrator picked up a stone that contained a peculiar symbol. "This is intriguing. This symbol is similar to the one we found in Baalbek. The connections are forming." Victor approached, examining the stone. If Mount Hermon and Baalbek share symbolism and construction, we really could be looking at a pattern of the Nephilim's influence on various civilizations. This can change our understanding of ancient architecture. The team continued exploring, each new discovery fueling the collective curiosity. The narrator felt they were on the verge of something significant. The connection between the Nephilim and ancient architecture was becoming clearer, but there was still much to discover. At the end of the day, as the sun set behind the mountains, the group gathered to discuss their discoveries. "What we found here may be just the tip of the iceberg," the narrator reflected. The Nephilim's influence may have permeated not only the construction of temples, but also the very essence of human civilization. We need to compare this with other sacred sites around the world, where the presence of gods or giants is mentioned. Caleb, energized, added, "Perhaps we should consider what this means for the historical narrative. If the stories of the Nephilim are more than myths, if they truly existed and impacted humanity, then we need to reevaluate everything." The narrator nodded, feeling the responsibility weighing on his shoulders. Yes, the search for truth is not just an archaeological journey. It is a journey to understand who we are and where we come from. And that leads us to a new destination, the connections between Mount Hermon and other sacred sites, where the presence of divine beings may have shaped history in ways we do not yet fully comprehend. With that shared determination, the team prepared for the next chapter of their investigation, aware that every step brought them closer to unveiling the mysteries surrounding the Nephilim and their legacy in the history of humanity. As the group assessed the ruins of the ancient altar on Mount Hermon, the narrator began to weave an intriguing comparison between this sacred site and other archaeological sites of historical importance, such as Baalbek and Göbekli Tepe. These megalithic structures are not mere coincidences on a map, he said, gesturing towards the horizon. They reflect a pattern of construction and beliefs that may be interconnected by centuries of history and myths. Caleb moved closer, his eyes gleaming with curiosity. So, are you suggesting there is a link between these places, that the cultures that built these monuments had a shared knowledge about the Nephilim, or at least about the same tradition? Exactly, the narrator replied, the words flowing with enthusiasm. Baalbek, for example, is famous for its gigantic building stones. The ancient Romans believed that place was dedicated to Jupiter, but its origins date back to much earlier times, when the legends of the Watchers were very much alive in the collective memory of the civilizations that inhabited the region. Emily, listening intently, added, and Göbekli Tepe, with its carved pillars and architectural complexity, challenges the traditional narrative that civilization began with agriculture. What is known is that a cult or a belief system already existed even before society settled in permanent settlements. Precisely, the narrator confirmed. These places are not just monuments, they are testimonies of the interactions between humans and beings that could be interpreted as gods or supernatural entities. This raises a crucial question. The worship of the Nephilim as gods may have shaped not only the architecture, but also the social and political structures of their societies. Victor, always analytical, frowned. If ancient societies saw the Nephilim as gods, doesn't that imply a hierarchy where humans were seen as inferior, almost like servants? That could have profound consequences on how civilizations developed and related to the sacred. Yes, the narrator replied, sensing the depth of Victor's reflection. What if we consider the possibility that the Nephilim were not just mythical figures, but that their stories reflect real interactions between human beings and entities that possessed advanced knowledge that could change our understanding of all ancient history? The group, now immersed in a fervent debate, began to draw parallels between the myths and the structures. The narrator, capitalizing on the energy of the discussion, continued, let's look more closely at the inscriptions and artifacts found not only on Mount Hermon, but also in Baalbek and Göbekli Tepe. If these places are interconnected, the evidence may be waiting to be discovered. The team paused and decided to examine the artifacts they had collected during the expedition. Emily began to organize the notes, while Caleb reviewed the photographs taken during the excavations. The narrator observed each of them, noting how the ideas intertwined and how the atmosphere was charged with excitement and anticipation. One interesting aspect, the narrator said, as he examined an inscription on one of the stones they had found, is that many of these places share similar symbols which seem to represent not only divinities, but also concepts of protection and power. What does this tell us about the perception of the Nephilim in different cultures? Caleb pondered. If cultures saw these beings as protectors, that could indicate that the stories of the Nephilim were more complex than just fears or reverence. There may be a duality in their image, where they were both gods and oppressors. Yes, and that duality may have influenced the way societies were structured, the narrator added, feeling the discussion deepening. The way stories are told can shape cultural and social identities. And what happens when those narratives encounter written history? How do myths intertwine with real historical events? Victor, always insightful, paused and reflected. That leads us to question how history is narrated and preserved. What is true and what is shaped by the need for control or understanding? The Nephilim, as central figures, may have been a way to explain phenomena that would otherwise be impossible to grasp. The narrator felt an urge to take the conversation further, knowing that every new revelation could bring forth more questions. As we explore, let's maintain that line of thought. We need a critical but also open perspective. Every discovery we make can bring us closer to the truth about what really happened after the flood. The team, now gathered around the table where the artifacts were displayed, began to discuss the next steps. The atmosphere was infused with renewed energy, a sense of urgency, and the perception that they were on the verge of something monumental. The comparisons between the different sites opened a new path of investigation, and everyone was willing to follow it. We are going to investigate the connections between these places and their respective histories more thoroughly, the narrator suggested. Every step we take can be a step towards understanding the Nephilim and the role they played in the formation of human civilization as we know it. With that renewed determination, the team prepared for the next phase of their journey, aware that the answers they sought could not only change their understanding of history, but also shed light on what the Nephilim represented and where, ultimately, they may have gone after the flood. The shadows of the past were about to dissipate, and what was hidden in them might be more impressive than they ever imagined. As the debate about the interconnectedness between ancient monuments heated up, the narrator decided it was time to address a sensitive topic. Let's consider the Orthodox narrative that rejects the idea of the Nephilim as real beings, he began, his voice taking on a more serious and thoughtful tone. Conventional archaeology often dismisses these figures as mere legends, products of collective imagination, or exaggerations of ancient cultures. Caleb frowned, absorbing the words. So, what do they claim? That all this is just a mythological construct with no real basis? Exactly, the narrator replied. Critics argue that the stories of the Nephilim are just metaphors to describe moral corruption and the failures of humanity. They see the sons of God and the daughters of men as representations of social classes or conflicts, not as a historical reality. Aaron, who had been listening in silence until then, decided to intervene. But doesn't that ignore the wealth of evidence we find in texts and artifacts that seem to corroborate the existence of these beings? How can we simply ignore them? The narrator nodded, acknowledging the validity of Aaron's point. It is an intriguing dilemma. On one hand, we have the resistance of academia to embrace alternative theories. On the other, the persistent presence of legends and accounts about the Nephilim, which do not easily dissipate. He paused, allowing the tension to settle among the team members. Victor, always the voice of reason, added, but we must remember that science is based on evidence. If there is no concrete proof of the Nephilim's existence, the Orthodox narrative will prevail. That doesn't mean we should discard alternative theories, but approach them with skepticism and rigor. The narrator felt the weight of Victor's words. I completely agree. The question here is, to what extent are we willing to challenge the established narrative? And what does that mean for our understanding of human history? If we accept that the Nephilim were more than myths, we must reconsider the implications about who we were and who we are now. Caleb, his mind buzzing with new ideas, asked, but what about the artifacts we found? Couldn't they serve as evidence to support the existence of the Nephilim? If the artifacts share similar characteristics with inscriptions that speak of them, shouldn't we take them more seriously? It's a possibility, the narrator replied, encouraging Caleb's critical thinking. However, we need careful analysis. The connection between the artifacts and the stories of the Nephilim may be more symbolic than literal, and this is where the Orthodox narrative is relentless. Critics claim that similarity is not evidence, but coincidence. Aaron, who had always been open to new ideas, posed a provocative question. What if, instead of viewing the stories of the Nephilim as just legends, we considered that they may have roots and real interactions with cultures that were, in fact, different from us? That perhaps the Nephilim represent a collective memory of beings who, in some way, influenced humanity? The narrator smiled, admiring the depth of the reflection. That is a fascinating hypothesis. If we accept the possibility that oral traditions and myths carry truths about the past, we might open a new door for investigation. The question to ponder is, how do we distinguish immemorial truths from constructed fictions? Caleb, who was becoming increasingly immersed in the discussion, raised a new point. But what about the archaeological evidence that contradicts the conventional narrative? There are places that defy the established chronology, like Göbekli Tepe, which seems to have been built before the advent of agriculture, going against the idea that civilization only began with permanent settlements. Don't these pieces of evidence warrant a reevaluation? Definitely, the narrator agreed. There are many aspects of history that don't fit perfectly into what has been taught. For example, the pyramids of Egypt, the complexity of Baalbek, and even the monuments of Machu Picchu raise questions about the knowledge and skills of ancient civilizations. If the Nephilim were real figures who influenced these cultures, what does that say about the relationship between human beings and what we consider divine? The atmosphere in the room was charged with tension and anticipation. The group was at a critical point where beliefs clashed with evidence, and the search for truth became increasingly intense. The narrator, sensing the team's energy, decided it was time to delegate tasks. Let's focus our efforts on the inscriptions we have found so far. What symbols do they contain? What stories can they tell us? We need to understand if there is a line connecting all this to the Nephilim. The team members dispersed, each dedicated to exploring different facets of the artifacts. As the investigation progressed, the narrator felt an internal conflict. He wondered if the alternative theories he himself championed could be more than just intellectual curiosity, if they could truly represent a long-hidden truth. What if the Nephilim were not just cautionary tales, but a reality that shaped the course of human history, he thought, as he watched his colleagues immersed in the search for answers. As the night progressed, the atmosphere around Mount Hermon became denser, as if the ancient energies of the place were awakening. The narrator knew that this investigation was about to reveal profound truths, but also that it could lead to a confrontation with established beliefs. The next steps would be crucial in defining not only the trajectory of the investigation, but also the very understanding of humanity's ancestral history. And so, with every new layer of evidence being unveiled, the team moved closer to a reality that could change everything known about the Nephilim and their place in the human narrative. The tension was building, and the narrator knew they were on the verge of a discovery that could challenge the very foundations of history. While the group's attention remained fixed on the discussion about the Orthodox narrative, the narrator decided it was time to introduce a practical aspect that could solidify the argument in favor of the Nephilim. "Let's take a look at the forensic evidence we have at hand," he suggested, his voice charged with new vigor. "What we have found so far in the excavation sites reveals tool marks that challenge our current understanding of the technology of the time." Caleb, always eager for knowledge, leaned forward, his eyes shining with a new determination. "Are you talking about the marks in Baalbek? That gigantic stone that weighs over 1,000 tons? "Exactly," the narrator confirmed, "but it's not limited to that. If we look at the stone of the pregnant woman and the trilithons of Baalbek, we notice that the precision of the surfaces is extraordinary, as if they had been cut with modern tools. Current science cannot explain how ancient civilizations could have developed such techniques." Aaron, already familiar with the subject, paused before intervening. "And what about the question of time? These constructions are beyond what our chronologies suggest. If the Nephilim truly existed, it would be reasonable to assume that their construction abilities far surpassed those of common humans of the time." The narrator nodded, appreciating the direction the conversation was taking. "That leads us to an intriguing question. If the tool marks are truly impossible for the time, what does that say about who really made them? Wouldn't it be plausible that the Nephilim, or beings they represented, influenced the construction of those structures?" Victor, as always the voice of reason, raised an eyebrow. "But that is still speculation, isn't it? We need concrete proof. What do we know about the construction techniques used at the time? Are there records that can help us understand how these structures were erected?" The narrator took a deep breath, aware of the need to address Victor's concern. "Yes, there are some records. Recent studies suggest that ancient civilizations used a combination of pulleys, levers, and stone-moving techniques that, even today, we cannot reproduce on a large scale. However, what distinguishes the monuments we investigate is the scale and precision. And what we found in Baalbek, for example, not only challenges the human capacity of the time, but also presents a pattern that is repeated in other places, such as Göbekli Tepe. So, what you are saying is that these constructions are not just a product of human labor, but maybe the result of the intervention of beings who had knowledge far beyond ours?" Caleb questioned, curiosity growing in his voice. "Exactly," the narrator replied, his passion for the truth evident. "If we accept that possibility, we would be forced to reconsider not only the history of the Nephilim, but also our own history. The consequences of that would be profound. We might be dealing with the collective memory of a race that not only existed, but also shaped humanity in ways we never imagined." Aaron, visibly intrigued, made a connection. What if these collective memories were a way of transmitting knowledge? If the Nephilim had taught humanity secrets of construction and technology, that could explain the similarities in structures found in different parts of the world, not only in the Middle East, but also in South America and other remote regions. The narrator agreed, energized by the new direction of the conversation. "Exactly. That suggests that, even after the flood, the Nephilim's influences might have endured through oral traditions and construction practices. The idea that these beings did not completely disappear can change the way we perceive the cultural and technological evolution of humanity." Victor, however, still seemed skeptical. "But there is still the question of concrete evidence. We need more than just theories. We need historical accounts, inscriptions, anything that can link the Nephilim to these constructions." The tension in the room was palpable, with each team member wondering how far they were willing to go in their search for truth. The narrator felt it was time to take a bold step. "Well, what if we start investigating these connections in a more practical way? We can plan an expedition to the most controversial places, where the evidence is most intriguing. What do you think?" Caleb shook his head, clearly excited. "That could be revolutionary. If we find more evidence, we could have a solid basis to challenge the conventional narrative." Aaron and Victor exchanged a look, considering the proposal. "I'm in," Aaron said, her determination clear. "I believe we need courage to explore what is outside the norm. Besides, we can't just ignore the possibility that the history we know is only the tip of the iceberg." Victor, despite his cautious nature, couldn't help but smile. I always believed that the truth is stranger than fiction. Let's see where this takes us. With new determination, the team began to outline their next steps. The narrator felt a wave of excitement as he watched his colleagues unite around a common cause. They were about to venture into unknown territory, challenging the orthodox narrative and opening themselves up to the possibility that the Nephilim had, in fact, left an indelible mark on the history of humanity. The questions still hung in the air. What really happened to the Nephilim after the flood? And what other truths could be revealed as they delved deeper into their investigation? The tension was growing, not only among the evidence they were about to explore, but also in the discovery of truths that could change the way they understood their past. Thus, with determination boiling, the team prepared for the next phase of their journey, aware that every discovery could be a key to unveiling the deepest mysteries of human history and the legacy of the Nephilim. The group continued to discuss the impressive tool marks found in Baalbek, but the narrator felt there was something deeper to explore. What could truly solidify the argument in favor of the Nephilim? He decided it was time to confront the question head-on. Let's ask ourselves, what do we know about the civilizations that existed before the flood and their technological capabilities? He proposed, his voice resonating under the roof of the makeshift ancient laboratory where they were gathered. Caleb, always passionate about discovering the truth, immediately responded, if the Nephilim were, in fact, an advanced civilization, then they would have to have access to knowledge and techniques that are unknown to us. The history we have is full of gaps. We need to understand how technology might have evolved before being destroyed by the flood. Aaron, with an attentive and insightful gaze, began to make connections. What if the Nephilim were not just isolated beings, but part of a larger network of civilizations that interacted with each other? Could we be talking about a cultural and technological legacy that extended across vast regions, connecting ancient peoples? Victor, still maintaining his critical stance, couldn't help but get involved in the discussion. It's an intriguing hypothesis, but what is the evidence? We need more than speculation to support that idea. The narrator nodded, understanding Victor's need for concrete proof. Let's analyze the megalithic structures we found. What do the stones in Baalbek and Göbekli Tepe tell us about the construction skills of those who erected them? He began to explicitly detail the characteristics of the rocks, revealing nuances that often went unnoticed. The stones of Baalbek, for example, are not only large, they are perfectly cut, with surfaces so smooth that they defy our current understanding of tools and techniques. Some theories suggest that the precision in the edges and in the assembly of those stones is close to what we find in modern constructions. Caleb looked at him with enthusiasm. That means that if the Nephilim really existed, their construction abilities might have been incomprehensible to current humanity. But then, how does this translate into the flood narrative? What happened to that knowledge? What we need to consider, the narrator continued, is that the flood narrative may have been an attempt to cleanse the history of an advanced civilization. If the Nephilim possessed deep and advanced knowledge, the flood could have been a way to reset humanity, but that doesn't mean their legacy was completely erased. Aaron, capturing the essence of the argument, said, it is possible that the Nephilim's traditions and knowledge were somehow transmitted, even after their supposed extinction. If they really left an impact, this could have survived in the stories, in the construction practices, and even in the agricultural techniques. The very concept of civilization could have been molded by them. Victor frowned. But where do we find proof of that? What would give us the certainty that they were not just part of the legends that were lost in time? Victor's question brought a reflective silence to the group. The narrator realized it was time to bring up an aspect that could change everyone's perception. Recent discoveries in various parts of the world have shown that many civilizations possessed construction techniques that, in turn, exhibit extraordinary similarities. Think of Pumapunku, the Nazca Lines, and even the pyramids of Egypt. What can be concluded from those comparisons? Caleb, now deeply immersed in the debate, replied, if we consider that these constructions were erected in different eras and places, we could be looking at a global phenomenon that is not limited to a single culture or region. That could suggest that there were mutual influences or even a common source of knowledge that, who knows, could be attributed to the Nephilim. Yes, the narrator agreed. And if the Nephilim were, in fact, a civilization that influenced various cultures, their teachings might have spread as a legacy that persisted even after their fall. The tool marks we find are not merely a challenge to our understanding, but a distant echo of a past that still reverberates in our history. Victor, despite his skepticism, began to see the logic in the conjectures. So, if the Nephilim didn't completely disappear, where would they be now? What happened to them after the flood? The narrator, realizing that the conversation was taking a promising direction, replied, "That is exactly what we need to investigate. The oral traditions that spread across various cultures around the world may provide clues about the Nephilim's trajectory. There are accounts of giants who inhabited the earth long after the flood. Could it be possible that some of those stories told about the descendants or representatives of the Nephilim? Or even about the survival of some of them?" Erin added, her voice charged with curiosity. "We could be looking at a fragment of history that refused to be forgotten, a collective memory that resists time." The narrator felt the group's energy intensifying. Everyone was now deeply involved in the search for answers. "Let's prepare to explore the oral traditions and accounts of different cultures. If the Nephilim left traces, perhaps we can follow them. Every story is a piece of a puzzle we need to assemble." Thus, with renewed determination, the group prepared for the next phase of their investigation, aware that the journey had just begun. The mystery of the Nephilim not only challenged traditional narratives, but also promised to open new doors to the understanding of humanity's history. The narrator took a deep breath, sensing the creative tension that hung in the air. He knew the conversation was about to take a deeper path, a path that could reveal the essential connection between the Nephilim and the civilizations that came after them. "We must consider the oral traditions that survived throughout the generations," he proposed, his voice grave with a weight of expectation. "These stories can offer us clues about what really happened after the flood." Caleb nodded, his gaze fixed on the narrator. "Are you referring to the myths that spread across various cultures? Many civilizations have their own versions of a great flood and figures that can be traced back to the Nephilim. That cannot be just a coincidence." "Exactly," the narrator confirmed. "If we look at the myths of creation and great catastrophes, we can perceive that these accounts often have common elements. The gods, the giants, the battles that resulted in destruction, and the subsequent regeneration of the world. It is possible that these stories are fragments of a collective memory that dates back to an era when the Nephilim truly existed." Erin, observing the interaction, decided to enter the conversation. What if these oral traditions were not just stories? What if they contained hidden truths about the knowledge and technology the Nephilim possessed? Could we be talking about a heritage that was passed down through the ages, transforming into legends that continue to be told, albeit in a distorted form? "That is intriguing," Victor said, his voice softer but still critical. "But we need concrete proof. What can we use to connect the dots between these narratives and the civilizations that emerged after the flood? We need a common thread." The narrator nodded, aware that they were on delicate ground. "Recently, some research identified similarities in the traditions of various cultures that had no direct contact with each other. Think of the accounts of giants in various mythologies, the Nephilim in Hebrew texts, the giants of Greek mythology, and even the great beings of Norse mythology. What does that indicate?" "A common race, perhaps," Caleb suggested, "or an archetype that reflects a deep fear or admiration of humans in relation to what they don't understand. If the Nephilim were an advanced civilization, that could explain the reverence and fear people felt for them. Or it could indicate a true connection," Erin added, "a cultural exchange that crossed continents and transformed over time. The stories may have been adapted, but the essence of the truth may still be there, waiting to be discovered." The atmosphere in the room was changing. The group felt increasingly energized by the possibility that the stories they had known since childhood might contain deeper truths about reality. The narrator, sensing the momentum of the conversation, decided to bring up an aspect that could tie up the loose ends. What if the true story of the Nephilim was not just their physical existence, but also the influence they had on the formation of cultures after the flood? What could they have left as a legacy? Victor, thoughtful, replied, "We need to consider the possibility that the Nephilim's wisdom infiltrated the agricultural practices, construction techniques, and even the spiritual beliefs of the civilizations that emerged later. That could explain why some ancient cultures had advanced knowledge that seems impossible for the time." The narrator saw an opportunity here. "We can observe that many of the principles of agriculture, astronomy, and construction, which emerged in civilizations like the Sumerian and Egyptian, may have roots in practices that were established before the flood. It is plausible that the Nephilim, as part of an advanced civilization, contributed to the development of those techniques." Caleb, increasingly energized, exclaimed, "What if we can find artifacts or ancient texts that mention that knowledge? Something that can serve as a link between the Nephilim and the peoples who came after them?" "That leads us to a crucial point," the narrator said. "We need to investigate the oral traditions and written records that survived more thoroughly. Every fragment of history, every legend, can be a clue that helps us reconstruct the narrative. Archaeology is not just about excavations, it is also about interpretation and understanding the stories people told over time. The group fell silent for a moment, absorbing the weight of the new revelations and possibilities. The narrator realized that the conversation was not just about artifacts or evidence, it was about the very essence of human history and how narratives shaped their understanding of the past. If the Nephilim truly existed and influenced later civilizations, he continued, then it is our responsibility to find those links and bring to light what was forgotten. The stories we tell and believe define our identity and our connection to history. Victor, now more involved than ever, nodded. What if what we are truly looking for is the truth hidden in the shadows of time? We cannot allow those fragments of wisdom to disappear. The narrator, now filled with determination, concluded, Exactly. The search for the Nephilim is a search for ourselves, for our roots, and for everything humanity could be. And as we explore these truths, we must remember that every narrative tells a part of the story, and every part, no matter how small, is crucial for understanding the whole. The group, now united by a common goal, felt the reinvigorating energy of discovery. What was to come next was not just an exploration of the past, but a journey in search of the very essence of humanity, a path that would lead them to a deeper understanding of the forces that shaped the world around them. They were ready to face whatever came, determined to unearth the truths the Nephilim left behind. The atmosphere was charged with a mixture of excitement and anticipation as the group continued to discuss the passage of time and the hidden truths that might be concealed in ancestral narratives. The narrator, in an effort to elucidate the question, decided to adopt a different approach. Let's delve a little deeper into the evidence that can link the Nephilim to cultures that emerged later. How about we look at the agricultural practices and technical knowledge that appear in the historical records of the Sumerian and Egyptian civilizations? Caleb, always curious, asked a pertinent question. But how can we affirm that this knowledge was not developed independently? Isn't it possible that the evolution of agriculture and architecture occurred without the influence of the Nephilim? It is a possibility, the narrator replied, pondering the question, but there are patterns that defy that idea. For example, agriculture in societies like Sumeria did not arise merely out of necessity, but seems to have been implemented in a way that suggests an advanced understanding of botany and natural sciences. Many of the irrigation and planting methods we have documented, especially in Uruk, show a level of sophistication that seems very ahead of its time. Victor, leaning forward, began to see the connection. Are you suggesting that this knowledge could have been transmitted by the Nephilim, as part of a legacy left to humanity before the flood, and which manifested in the cultures that followed? Exactly, the narrator affirmed, his voice resonating with a new certainty. If we consider that the Nephilim were, in fact, beings of great wisdom and technology, it is plausible that they influenced the way future civilizations developed. When we look at the monumental architecture of places like the pyramids of Egypt, we cannot ignore the speculations about how those structures were truly built. If the Nephilim possessed advanced engineering knowledge, that could explain the precision and scale of the constructions. Aaron, absorbing everything, made a connection. What if those teachings were passed down orally as part of ancestral knowledge? Oral traditions are often seen as mere fables, but what if they contained fragments of truths that were forgotten over time? Yes, Caleb agreed. The stories of giants and gods who walked among men may, in fact, be a distorted memory of real events. Each culture may have interpreted those encounters in its own way, but the essence may be the same, and the similarities in the stories from different parts of the world cannot be ignored. The narrator saw the flame of curiosity ignite in the eyes of his companions and continued, Let's look at the Sumerian texts. Through their inscriptions, we know they had a profound understanding of astronomy and mathematics. The devices they used to measure time and agricultural seasons are remarkable. It's hard to believe that this knowledge arose in isolation. So, how can we connect all this to the history of the Nephilim? Victor asked, his mind working quickly. If these beings really existed and influenced civilizations, what kind of message might they have left for us? The narrator paused for a moment, reflecting on the question. Perhaps the most important message is the need for balance between knowledge and ethics. The Nephilim, having descended to Earth and interfered in human life, left a legacy that teaches us about the consequences of abusing knowledge. The stories surrounding them can serve as warnings about the irresponsible use of power and technology. The conversation flowed naturally, each contributing their own observations and theories. The atmosphere was charged with a creative electricity as the group members explored the intersections between reality and mythology. At the same time, the tension intensified, as if they were on the verge of a great revelation. The narrator decided it was time to bring up an aspect that could unite the various conversations. If we consider that the Nephilim might have influenced not only agricultural and architectural practices, but also the spiritual beliefs of subsequent civilizations, we can see an even more intriguing pattern. What was considered sacred in later cultures may have roots in that initial contact. That raises a fascinating question, Caleb said. If the Nephilim were considered gods or demigods by some cultures, how did that shape the way humans viewed their own divinities? The stories may have transformed into myths, but the reverence and fear of those beings may have persisted. Victor, always the skeptic, raised an eyebrow. But what if all this is nothing more than a social construct? What prevents us from dismissing these ideas as mere attempts to establish a narrative that justifies the greatness of ancient civilizations? That will depend on what we decide to consider as truth, the narrator replied, challenging the group to reflect on their own beliefs. We are so used to seeing history as linear and rational, but what if it is more complex, intertwining myths and realities? By embracing that complexity, we can enter a territory where hidden truths are revealed. The conversation revolved around the tension between faith in the traditional narrative and the search for a deeper truth. The narrator perceived that there was a palpable energy in the room, an expectation that the discussion could lead to a significant revelation. We need to explore the archaeological evidence more thoroughly. What else can we discover that can serve as a common thread between the Nephilim and the civilizations that emerged after the flood? The expectation grew, creating an emotional climax that needed to be resolved. The group, now more united than ever, began to explore new directions, ready to challenge the norms and discover what really happened after the flood. With their minds full of possibilities, the narrator felt they were about to enter unexplored territory, where the line between myth and reality began to blur. The group was immersed in reflections, and the narrator realized it was the right moment to consolidate the information that had been discussed until then. Let's recap the evidence we gathered, he began, in a tone that drew everyone's attention. Our investigation so far has shown us an intriguing pattern, where the Nephilim's influence might be deeper than many imagine. Caleb, eager to understand better, asked, "But how can we connect all the elements we analyzed? From oral traditions to agricultural and construction techniques, everything seems very dispersed." The narrator nodded, acknowledging the complexity of the question. "That is exactly what I want to explore. Imagine that all those fragments are parts of a puzzle. If we can put those pieces together, the final image may reveal the Nephilim's presence not only as mythical figures, but as real influencers in the formation of civilizations." Victor, who was attentive, made an observation. If the Nephilim really left a legacy, they couldn't have limited themselves to just transmitting technical knowledge. There would also be a cultural, ethical aspect, which could have shaped the civilizations that followed. "Exactly," the narrator exclaimed, energized by the idea. "These beings, upon descending to Earth, did not just bring technology, they also brought a new way of thinking about the world. The balance between power and responsibility is a lesson that resonates for millennia." "That ethic is fundamental to understanding what happened next," Ryan said, who seemed to have a new perspective. "The civilizations that emerged not only absorbed knowledge, but may also have learned to deal with the consequences of using that knowledge." The narrator smiled, satisfied with the direction the conversation was taking. "And that leads us to a crucial point. How did Sumeria develop agriculture and architecture with such sophistication? If we look at the evidence, we cannot ignore that many of the irrigation methods were advanced for the time." Aaron, always attentive, intervened with an intriguing question. What if these techniques were not only influenced by a natural understanding, but by a direct teaching from the Nephilim? They could have been responsible for boosting that evolution. The narrator nodded again, recognizing the validity of the idea. "That is a hypothesis we must seriously consider. Sumeria, with its knowledge of astronomy and mathematics, could have been a laboratory of experimentation for those ideas. If the Nephilim truly existed and interacted with humans, it is plausible that they left their marks in various areas." With the conversation taking a deeper turn, the narrator brought up a topic that few had considered until then. "Do you remember the stories that narrate about giants? Many cultures have versions of those legends. What if, behind those narratives, there is a core of truth that dates back to the Nephilim? Each culture, in telling its stories, might have reinterpreted encounters with those beings in ways that reflected their own realities and mythologies." Caleb, excited, began to connect the dots. So, the similarities in the stories of various cultures can be seen as echoes of the same event? And could that reinforce the idea that these beings were not just isolated figures, but part of a global phenomenon? The narrator nodded, emphasizing the strength of the argument. "Exactly." When we look at oral traditions and ancient texts, we perceive that there is a recurring theme of beings who descended from the sky, bringing knowledge and, in many cases, conflict. That leads us to think about the possibility that the Nephilim not only existed, but that their influence permeated the societies that came after. Ryan, with a thoughtful look, said, "But that leads us to a dilemma. If the Nephilim's presence had such an impact, what happened to them after the flood? If they didn't disappear, where are they now? And what legacy did they leave besides the stories?" The narrator took a deep breath, aware that the answer to those questions could define the conclusion of their investigation. These are questions that lead us to the essence of what we are trying to unveil. History is not limited to past events. It is a continuity of legacies and teachings. If the Nephilim were, in fact, beings of great power and wisdom, their message about the responsible use of knowledge might be more alive now than we think. As if the narrator's words had released a current of inspiration, the group began to discuss fervently. Each one brought their own ideas, and the room was filled with a vibrant energy. The narrator felt that there, in that moment, they were forming not only a conclusion, but a deeper understanding of the human condition and its relationship with knowledge. "We are on the verge of a significant closure," the narrator said, observing the enthusiasm of the participants. "Our investigation not only reveals the history of the Nephilim, but also provokes questions about how we deal with what we know. The message they left, if they truly existed, may be more relevant now than ever." The atmosphere was charged with a palpable expectation as the group prepared for the final chapter of this journey. The narrator knew that what would follow would be crucial. They were about to tie up all the loose ends in the final. Synthesis of the gathered information could open new doors to the understanding of humanity and its legacy, and so, with his mind buzzing with ideas, the narrator prepared to guide his companions toward the culmination of their quest. The narrator, sensing the depth of the discussion, decided it was the ideal moment to address the question that floated in the air like a dense fog. Let's consider, then, how Sumeria did not arise merely out of necessity, but seems to have been implemented in a way that suggests an advanced understanding of botany and natural sciences. What does that mean for our understanding of the Nephilim and their role in human history? Caleb, always eager to discover new details, raised his hand. If the Nephilim truly influenced the development of agriculture in Sumeria, how did that manifest in the practices we observe in the excavations? Would there be traces that could indicate that direct contribution? "That is an excellent question," the narrator replied, energized. "The analysis of Sumeria's agricultural techniques reveals knowledge that goes beyond what would be expected for the time. For example, the way they implemented irrigation, creating complex canals, suggests there was a deep understanding of water flow and soil fertility. What if, behind that, there was a teaching that did not originate merely from observation, but from a more direct transfer of knowledge, possibly from the Nephilim?" Victor, now with a more critical eye, pondered. "But how can we validate that hypothesis? Are there records or artifacts that can corroborate that connection between the Nephilim and Sumeria's agricultural practices?" "Yes," the narrator replied. "Sumerian texts, although scarce, contain references to gods who taught skills to humans. Those gods, often described as giants, may be a representation of the Nephilim. Furthermore, artistic representations of immense figures in temples suggest that those beings were not just myths, but had a significant role in the formation of that society." Aaron, who was always attentive to nuances, intervened. "What if we look at the oral traditions of other cultures? They often mention beings who descended from the sky, bringing not only technology, but also moral and ethical teachings that could reinforce the idea that the Nephilim's influence was not limited to technical aspects, but extended to the foundations of civilization." The narrator nodded, enthusiastic about the line of reasoning. "Exactly. Oral traditions, from Native Americans to African and Asian cultures, often speak of beings who brought knowledge and, in many cases, warnings about the use of that knowledge. That suggests that the interaction with the Nephilim might have shaped not only technology, but also the ethics of the civilizations that emerged." Ryan, who had been listening intently until then, added, "But what happened to them after the flood? If they really existed and influenced humans, why did they disappear from the historical narrative? That absence is as intriguing as their very presence." "That is the most difficult, and at the same time, the most fascinating question," the narrator replied, looking at each team member. "The absence of the Nephilim in post-Diluvian narratives can be interpreted in several ways. One possibility is that, after the catastrophe, their influence was so deeply rooted that they became part of the cultural and social fabric, invisible, but always present. Another hypothesis is that, perceiving the consequences of their actions, they chose to withdraw, leaving humanity to deal with what they had started. Caleb, reflecting on the conversation, asked, "And what about the accounts of giants that persist in various cultures? Could they be echoes of a collective memory that dates back to the interaction with the Nephilim? Could it be possible that those stories were a way of preserving knowledge about them?" "Yes," the narrator affirmed. "Legends about giants can be seen as a way of keeping alive the memory of the Nephilim and the teachings they brought. Each culture, in reinterpreting those stories, might be trying to understand its own place in the world and the consequences of its past." As the group continued to discuss, the narrator perceived that the conversation had evolved into something more significant. What we are truly exploring here is the continuity of human curiosity. Our search for answers, our desire to understand what happened and why, is what unites us. The Nephilim, whether mythical figures or real influencers, challenge us to question our origins and the impact that the choices of our ancestors had on the formation of the world we inhabit. The atmosphere in the room began to change as each of the group members felt the gravity of the narrator's words. And so, at the end of this journey, we should not seek a definitive answer. The mystery of the Nephilim remains as an invitation to continuous reflection and exploration. With every question we ask, with every fragment of truth we discover, we expand our understanding not only about them, but about ourselves. The narrator looked around, observing the faces of his companions, now illuminated by a new understanding. Therefore, I invite you to continue this search for the unknown. May the curiosity that brought us here never diminish, and may we always seek the answers that await us in the shadows of history. With that, this group came together in silence, each absorbing the depth of the discussion. The mystery of the Nephilim, far from being a mere curiosity, had become a symbol of the eternal human quest for knowledge and understanding. And, as they prepared to leave that place, they knew that the story did not end there, but continued to unfold, always awaiting new discoveries and reflections. In that moment, the narrator, now more than a guide, was a companion on the journey, sharing the burden and the beauty of the unknown. And so, as night fell over River Valley, the team departed, carrying with them not only questions, but the certainty that the search for answers is, in itself, a vital part of the human experience. The history of the Nephilim, with all its complexities, would continue to resonate through time, challenging generations to venture in search of what is truly eternal.